All right, today on this How I Lead interview, we're headed to the Billings, Montana stake with, first of all, Dale Williams, the stake president. How are you, Dale?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Kurt.
Good. And I guess the person who mainly gets the credit for lining this up is your young women's stake president, which is Sara Payne. Sara, welcome.
Stake Relief Society president,
Are you
actually.
relieved? Okay. Well, hey, we're keeping
yeah,
that mistake.
We're all kids inside. That's what I
Okay.
said. We're all kids inside. So
okay, cool, nice. I guess the reason they got the youth in my mind is that Colette Hall was the one that connected us. And Sara, you're friends with Colette, and with Colette, we talked about the youth and whatnot. But then she recommended you and President Williams as some sort of unique approaches that you're doing in leadership and just communication and just running the stake in a way that is effective. So we're going to dive into those. President Williams, maybe start us off. Just give us an idea of the Billings, Montana stake.
So what I would think is just a typical stake. We've got pretty good normal demographics. A lot of families. We have a one branch. We're in Montana, so we have to have a branch. It's a ways away. And then we have one young single adult unit in our ward or in our stake as well. So, but we've got a lot of young families in our stake. In Sara's ward in particular, it's clear full of young families. But then we have the demographic of some older couples and singles, a lot of singles in our stake as well.
Great. And how long have you been the stake president?
So I've been stake president for 5 years as the stake president.
Nice. Very good. And then Sara, how long have you been serving as Relief Society president?
Almost 2 years.
Okay. Very good. Very good. And I guess where do you, Sara, maybe just tell from your experience, like, had you been a ward Relief Society president before this opportunity?
I was in a branch. I was a branch Relief Society president, in a little town in Maine, and so I had experience, in that calling before. Nice. So which definitely helped prepare me to work at the stake level.
Cool. And was there a story behind being called as the stake Relief Society president?
Oh, I think so. I remember, when you get a call from the clerk saying we want both you and your husband to come in and meet with the stake president, like, I think I said to my husband, maybe he just wants to, I don't know, see how we're doing. There. And I remember my husband saying, you just keep telling yourself that. Uh-huh. And I was, at the time I was serving as a counselor in the stake primary presidency. That had been my calling for a little over a year. And so I'd gotten to know the stake presidency a little bit, and more importantly, just like the people throughout the stake, right? And serving in that way. And so what I remember most about that day was President Williams saying to me, we're looking for someone who's willing to think outside the box. And I felt like that was like him giving me permission to do things a little bit differently. And I've always appreciated that, always. So
yeah. And Dale, I mean, with your approach to, I'm sure Sara wasn't the first, organizational leader that you called. What's your approach when extending those calls? What have you learned over the years? What could you teach us from your own experience?
Well, as our previous Relief Society president was coming up on the time to be released. We keep them in about a 3-year period of time generally. And as we were counseling together as a stake presidency, we had talked about the demographics of our stake with all these young families and the needs of some of the younger sisters as well as the single sisters. And so we've talked about different names, and we make lists trying to do our work on receiving revelation on where we should go. And as we had gotten to know Sara because of her calling in the primary presidency, and when her name was discussed, it was, well, she approaches things a little differently. And I said, well, that's exactly what we need. And so when we extended the call, that's why I said, we're looking for somebody that does things outside the box. She didn't give me the privilege of knowing what outside the box meant at the time. So
I
Nice.
don't think he knew what he was getting into fully at all.
Nice. So, Sarah, where did this reputation come from as far as doing things a little differently? What do you think
Oh,
was behind that?
that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a life coach in my profession, and I have a podcast, and so I think that I'm just kind of have trained myself to think about things differently, or what about this, or have we thought about it this way, or what if it's not so bad that kids these days are doing things this way? And so I think I must have just gained a reputation in that regard. So
Nice, nice. And then, so Dale, you're walking into this extending the calling with that, I guess that reputation that Sarah has, a positive one for sure. When you said to think outside the box, like, was there more to that, or is that something you say a lot to other organizational leaders?
No, that was the first time I had said it, and
Okay.
it won't be the last time, because I just felt like we needed a fresh approach. We had just had this introduction of new way of doing things, higher and holier way of doing things. What does ministry mean? What does loving one another mean? What does it look like? And her approach was a little different than the old visiting teaching model. And so she just viewed things differently that we could see. And we said, that's what we need. We need this change that looks at things differently. What does the Relief Society do? Well, we need to have a different look at what the Relief Society does, what their role
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, that's great. Principle I want to highlight here is just this action that's so crucial for leaders to do of giving permission to individuals, because in these roles, like, we don't want to necessarily shake the box, and
Mhm.
none of us want to be a renegade or anything like that. And so, we want to just stay in the box a lot of time and just be a good soldier and do what we're asked to do. And so just that per- permission of saying, you know what, we do want you to think outside the box and and do some things differently. So, Sarah, what anything else coming to mind as far as this thinking outside the box? Like, did you feel that permission? Like, did it feel freeing?
I definitely did feel like I had permission to just maybe challenge the status quo a little bit. Like, that's kind of how I interpreted that. Like, just because it's the way things have always been done, maybe it's not the way we have to continue to do them. But then for sure, I can't remember exactly what I was thinking in the beginning, but I'm sure those first state council meetings, I felt very intimidated or had a hard time. I always speak up. I always share my opinion, but I probably shared it more shakily and with less confidence than I do now. Just not ever having been a part of, meetings like that before being the Relief Study president. Yeah. And then just as we as I continued to um develop my relationship with myself as in this calling, and also just like with President Williams and the other members of the state presidency and state council, it was easy for me to believe like my opinion matters here and my voice matters here. And so that is really I feel like President Williams has created such an environment of openness that like we all feel like we can say what we think, even if it's not the same thing that the person who commented before us thinks. So
Yeah. So Dale, teach us about, I mean, how do you do that? Maybe it's something that just comes naturally. It's not like you're thinking through this is, step A, B, and C to do that. But what comes to mind as far as being effective in helping your other leaders feel that?
Well, maybe it comes to that I have no idea what to do to begin with, and I need to gather the ideas of everybody else to formulate
Yeah.
my own ideas. And there's some truth to that. I think counseling together and gathering the ideas of the leaders is really what the primary role of the person presiding at a meeting should be. And so I want to gather what their thoughts are. And sometimes with some of our organization leaders, they're hesitant to participate. They had been in the past. They've been hesitant to participate, and that doesn't work for me because I don't have any ideas. So I need to get some ideas from the members of the
Yeah.
council. So I
Yeah.
try to
Hesitancy
open them
really
up.
doesn't serve you as the leader, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
so and that's I try to do that. even in my individual meetings or interviews, is I want to get the idea of what's on their mind. In an individual interview as well as in a state council, we'll ask, what's on your mind? What are you thinking about?
That's great. Is that often like just a way that you'll start a meeting, or is asking that and putting the feelers out?
Yes. Yeah. And
that's the way he starts every meeting with me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Every meeting is what's going on with me. And he does it in state council too. And I think what he's like, I didn't recognize this or wasn't able to articulate it until just our most recent state council meeting. But I feel like what he's saying when he says that he's not actually saying is like, I trust that the Spirit is working through you. Tell me what the Spirit has been telling you lately.
Yeah, that's empowering for sure. And I know the temptation, serving in the stake presidency. I remember those days of you have, presidency meeting and you talk a good hour or so about different things, and you can't help but put an agenda together for the next high council meeting or the next state council meeting. And so it's easy to walk into those meetings with an agenda of like, here's 10 things we're going to talk about because this is on our mind. And they may feel and look like really, important things, but it takes some discipline to say, well, we may get there, or let's see how many of these items on this list are what the other leaders are thinking about. And so by starting asking that question, I can see how that can be really effective.
And that's something we try to do. Is we do have agendas when we come in, so it's not a free for all on what. But before we get to the agenda items, I want to know what's on the mind of the members of the council, whether it's a stake presidency or whether it's an individual interview or whether it's a stake council. And so many times what's been on the mind of the stake presidency and what we've talked about in our stake presidency will align with the stake council and the members of the stake council. And sometimes they think of things that we should have had on the agenda to begin with, but we didn't get there until we counseled together to see what's on the minds of the members.
So this plays into the different principles that you two sent me prior to this interview. Is one, just this communication, and which leads to others believing that you're on the same team, right? I think this is generally what we're talking about. Anything else around sort of that cultural that culture you're establishing in these meetings? Anything else you'd add as far as how you go about doing that?
Well, maybe one thing is sometimes I'll have an agenda item that I want to talk about and that I feel inspired that we should talk about. But many times that agenda item will morph or change a little bit after I've sought the counsel of those that are in the meeting. And I feel like if I were to come in and say, here's what we're going to talk about today, that's the only thing that we would talk about that day. And so I feel like it closes down openness if, as the presiding leader, that I say, this is what I think we should talk about. Then everybody else feels like they just fall in line and say, yes, that's what we'll talk about. So I think it's good to get the opinion and the insights of others before I say where my thoughts are.
Yeah. Anything you'd add to that, Sarah? Or is that?
Yeah, just that he states his opinion last, which I think in the church we're really good at respecting our leaders and authority. And so sometimes if the leader says, what they think first, then it's like, well, I was kind of thinking the opposite, but I'm not going to say that because, he's a stake president. Yeah. So he always saves his opinion for last. And that's been something that I've taken into my own presidency to I want to know what my counselors and secretary think first. And then again, my opinion, just like President Williams said, my opinion often changes before I even get the chance to share it. And then the other thing that came to mind was, I can't remember exactly how you say it, President Williams, but some version of like revelation happens in groups or we all get a piece of the revelation. And so that gives me permission to like share what's coming to my heart and mind in the meetings that we have together.
It's the revelation that's scattered among us from council.
Yes,
that's from several of our church leaders.
That's a powerful principle.
Used that.
Yeah. So President Williams, with you, like, is there, to speak or to give your opinion last or whatnot? I mean, that's it's sounds easier than it really is, at least from my experience. Is that, I mean, what's that discipline look like, or how do you make sure that you don't allude or lean one way to the other as discussion is happening?
Well, I wish it were as easy as it's not easy, and I don't do it perfectly, but I
Yeah.
try to not taint what other people might have thought prior to coming in or as we're having that discussion. And so it's mainly making sure we hear from everybody first. And the truth be known, that majority of the time after we've asked others for their input, my thoughts or my emphasis or sometimes my entire opinion of what I was thinking previously will change. And so I think that's part of the revelatory process of gaining information through counseling together, gaining revelation through counseling together.
Yeah. Yeah, that's powerful. All right. Anything else as far as that concept, as far as the communication that's happening, being on the same team? Did we cover it pretty well?
Yeah, I think just as I'm thinking about it, I think there's a fine line between like respecting our leaders and then putting them up like on a pedestal above us where like they're all knowing. And I think President Williams does a really good job of like being open and vulnerable and being like, listen, like I'm working through all of this. I'm just trying to live the gospel like everybody else, and this is just the calling that I've been given right now. And so when we can see ourselves like on the same team as those that we're working with, it kind of makes it easier to say what we're really thinking and what's going on for us and the inspiration that we're receiving versus just defaulting to, well, he must know best because, he's the stake president, so.
Yeah. So President Williams, do you want to go on record and say that you are not all-knowing?
Yeah, I'll go on record. Right? Thanks, Kurt.
Okay. All right. Nice. So talk to me about unity. This is an interesting principle that you sent me as far as your approach to unity, because sometimes it can feel like unity is like when we go in a meeting and everybody agrees and we just love each other. Like there's definitely no contention, but there's definitely no conflict either, right? It's just smooth and going together. So how do you aim and reach for unity, and how does it get messy sometimes? Sarah, do you want to jump in on that one first?
Yeah. I think the first, like the thing that helps the most is going into any interaction believing that we're on the same team. So like I know that he and I are on the same team. He wants what's best for the sisters in the stake. I want what's best for the sisters in the stake. And then knowing like we're probably not always going to agree on what that looks like, but just knowing that like having that basis, like we're on the same team, then when we discuss the needs of the sisters, I'm willing to say like, I don't agree with this or that, can we do it differently? And even if he says, I mean, there have been moments in his office when we've kind of like, no, but we're arguing back and forth about, it's like very respectful. But there's conflict there for sure. But knowing like, yeah, he wants what's best for them and I want what's best for them. We're going to work this out. And that I think is very, very helpful. Like one way that I think I've kind of like shaken things up in our stake is just some of the traditions that we've had where the Relief Society sisters take care of these meals and help with these certain service projects. And as I've kind of pushed up against some of that, which has been easy for me to do because of the principles we've talked about previously, just like I know that my opinion matters, and I see him as like I respect him and his calling, but I also see him as a peer. Then it's easy for me to like kind of push up against some of the cultural norms that like all stakes have, right? And when we do that, then if he disagrees with me, like that's fine because I know that we both want what's best, and And then I think it's just easier to like actually say what I really think, and knowing that like unity doesn't mean I'm going to quote unquote get my way. Like I am thinking of all the sisters in the stake, and he's thinking of everyone in the stake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anything you'd add to that, President Williams, as far as the
let me just
share with unity and establishing unity?
Yeah, well, let me just share a quick example of this idea of not always agreeing that this is the way it ought to be. We had a tradition of the Relief Society had a food committee, and this food committee, anytime we had a missionary meal or a transfer meal or a zone conference meal or a steak meal, we called the Relief Society, and we asked the Relief Society to take care of it. And that was perhaps one of the first things she said right from the beginning. She said, you wanted me to think outside the box. What if we didn't do this? I don't think this is the way this ought to be. I don't think this is the role of the Relief Society. And and so we counseled together, and we decided, well, let's not let's disband this food committee that we've utilized in the past. And you know what? The steak didn't fall apart. The missionaries haven't gone hungry, and it's been spread out, and the Relief Society now takes a turn at providing meals. Mm-hmm. Instead of being the food committee, they take their turn along with the stake young men's and along with the activities committee, some of the high council. So that's something that has, and it's brought better unity and understanding of what the role of the Relief Society and the Relief Society president is. So sometimes we have preconceived ideas of the way things ought to be. And I'll just share a quick story. When I was first called as a bishop, this was a lot of years ago. It was within the first couple of weeks. I had a call in the middle of the night of a sister that was in need. So I called my counselor, and we went over to this young lady's house, and she was having a manic moment, and she was seeing bugs on the wall. And she was convinced there were bugs on the wall. And I spent the first 40 minutes telling her there weren't bugs on the wall. And the Spirit told me directly, this is not the approach. You are not going to convince her there's not bugs on the wall, because that's what she sees. And so when I backed off of what I thought ought to be there and what she thought ought to be there, I said, well, I'm going to come to where she is. And so I've used this example a lot of times when I'm visiting with people who are having marriage trouble. I'll say, you know, your reality is different than your husband's reality. You might see, the husband might be seeing bugs on the wall, and you don't see bugs on the wall. And so what if both of you would just take back and say, I may be wrong and he may be wrong or she may be wrong. What if we figured out what God wants? If we all want what God wants, then I have opportunity to change what I think as a husband, and you have an opportunity what you have to want or think as a wife, and we can come together in unity instead of standing battle lines and fighting on battle lines. And so that's the way I viewed this this idea of the food committee. Is she said, I saw that this was a good, efficient way to run the stake. It worked out really well. She saw it differently. And once I stepped back from it and saw what she saw, then we said, there's a different way we can do this. And I think it's a better way for our stake, and it's functioned better that way.
Yeah, because there's sort of that, the allure of efficiency, right? Because this works. Like, Sarah, don't break it if it works, you know, that type of thing. But there's maybe a larger perspective to consider rather than is it efficient or not? And because there may be other ways to make things efficient.
I've said it a lot of times in our stake. What is efficient isn't always effective. Those are two different things. Efficiency in parenting, there's a lot of things we do efficiently, like do the dishes yourself. It's not effective for long-term learning, though. And so I think there's a difference between effective and efficient.
Nice. Anything else we haven't touched on as far as the concept of unity and building unity?
I just would, as I'm thinking about like this example of like the food committee, you know, I think there's a place for the Relief Society also to to be willing to like let other people do something that they do well and not do it as well as they do it, like or do it differently than they do it. And so I like that we don't it's kind of the like what you said about efficiency and effectiveness. Like it's okay if they do it differently. Like that's the point, isn't like who can do it best all the time. The point is like we want to create a different culture here, right? And a different narrative. And so I think as women in particular, sometimes like we just need to step back and be like, we're just going to let them do it. We're going to let, like, they're willing to do it. The High Council is going to do the dinner. This is amazing. I love it. Like whatever they do is going to be awesome, even if it's different than the way that I would do it.
It might look, the presentation might be a little different when the High Council does it versus when the Relief Society does it. Yes.
Yeah, so true, right? And that's okay, you know, and just because sometimes we feel like, yeah, but no, this visiting authority's coming, and you know, we got to make sure that the tablecloth is straight and ironed, right? But at the end of the day, if the elders quorum or High Council rolls in with pizza, like, hey, you're gonna eat and you're not gonna go hungry, right?
Yes.
That's awesome. Tell me about just, well, let me ask in sort of relation to that. What is the cadence as far as like your interaction together? Do you have regular one-on-one meetings as the stake president and the stake relief society president, or how do you, outside of just the general council meetings, how does that unity get built between the two of you?
Do you want to answer that, President Williams?
Well, I'll give the cadence, and then if you'll talk, maybe you can talk about what we talk about. But I have a wonderful executive secretary that does all my work for me. So we meet about once a month for interviews, along with the bishops. We meet about once a month with the Stake Relief Society president.
Nice, awesome. And then how do those meetings go for you, Sarah?
No, I love them. I think it was actually my friend Colette that I was telling her about something in the meeting once, and she said, that's not normal, right? You should share this with people because it's awesome. I feel like I don't run the meeting, but I bring whatever is on my mind. And that comes from him asking me at the beginning of every meeting, like, what's on your mind? What do you want to talk about? And so it's not uncommon for me to, message him a few days before and be like, I've just read this conference talk. Will you review it again? Because I think that we could discuss this and this about this talk that would be useful for the sisters. And and so I really feel like I have a lot of just input and say in what goes on in those meetings. I feel like it's for the sisters, and he knows that I know what's going on with the sisters. And so I get to kind of, I wouldn't say lead the discussion, but I have a lot of say in what we talk about in those meetings.
I love it. And to me, that's a big, maybe sometimes overlooked, just with the busyness of being a leader and the different meetings and demands that are there, that just that those one-to-one interactions are just overwhelmingly time well spent, connecting with individuals so they feel heard, and outside of that group setting where they, maybe it is easier to speak up or to share an unpopular opinion, or when there's one-to-one setting. So then just tell me about the last principle you put down here is just like creating your state council and stewardship interviews are a safe space for all kinds of opinions. Anything you do to facilitate that we haven't touched on already?
Before our stake presidency, or at the beginning of our stake presidency meeting, at the beginning of our state council, and the beginning of all the interviews, I want to counsel together with them. We have our agenda items. We have the things that we need to talk about. We have the things we need to work through. But I feel like if we will talk about a gospel principle, if we'll talk about a concern that one of us might have, or something that we've heard throughout the stake that we've had, if we can counsel together about that, I think it invites the Spirit. And what happens at the end of the meeting is the business becomes much easier to work through. because we've come to a unity of thinking. We've melded our views a little better, and so when it comes to the business, it flows faster and it works better. So in a stake presidency meeting, we might spend the first 20 minutes or 30 minutes talking about a gospel principle or a portion of the church handbook of instruction before we actually get to the agenda items. And we do the same in our stake councils as well as our high council.
Awesome. And Sara, for you, you talked about early on that you were sort of hesitant to speak up just because, you're the newbie in the room, right? Even as the Stake Relief Society president. Was there anything else we haven't discussed as far as how you felt more and more safe to share perspectives and opinions? Or?
Yeah, I think that I just felt like my opinion mattered, that it was never dismissed or or overlooked, and not just by President Williams and his counselors, but by the entire state council. I feel like the state councils that we have are like exactly what President Nelson would want a state council to look like. Like he could come in and video them. They're or for that matter, what the Savior envisions like a council to look like. And so that and I think that it should be said too that President Williams and his counselors as well, they are open and vulnerable and they share things that they're going through. And so it makes it easier for us as members of the council to do the same. I remember in particular, there was one time, I think this was in a stewardship interview with just he and I, but I had recognized in my own personal study that I had some questions about President Nelson. I was like, I noticed when I'm listening to him speak in conference, I'm having these doubts come up, and so I prayed about it, and I was thinking about what I felt inspired to listen to every conference talk he'd given since he was the prophet, and to just really try to understand, these doubts I was having. And I remember I felt completely safe to share that with President Williams. I knew that he wouldn't judge me. I knew that he would just maybe have questions or just talk to me about it, and my heart was totally changed as I listened to all of these talks again that the prophet had given. And as I was sharing this with President Williams, he paused and he said, "Will you please share that with the sisters?" And as you go, we in our stake, the Stake Relief Society president, they are kind of viewed as a high council person. And so we go and we speak in the sacrament meetings of the different wards throughout the year as well. And he said, share that, please share that doubts are okay and that there's a way to turn to the Savior to work through them. So.
Wow, that's cool. Maybe President Williams, you can speak to this. Sara mentioned that oftentimes you and your counselors will share what you're going through. Does an example of what that looks like come to mind?
Yeah, so we have members in the stake who are struggling with adult children, where the adult children are questioning the way they were raised and that they have concerns about they didn't have agency. And well, that's me. I have that. We have 8 children, and some of them are having questions, and so I think it's good for me to share that we're having some of those same concerns. In fact, we have a stake conference coming up this weekend, and that's one of the topics that will be talked about is I'm going to address the stake as if I was talking to my family on where their questions might be, where their answers might be coming from. So I think it's important to show some vulnerability. We very seldom do we come together because we have strengths that are alike. We usually come together more unity-wise when we have weaknesses that are alike. That's why we love the Savior so much, I think, is because he accepts us knowing all of our vulnerabilities and all of our weaknesses and still loves us.
Yeah, that's such a crucial principle to sit with and consider is, oftentimes in leadership, for example, like a fifth Sunday lesson, maybe it's fifth Sunday, the bishop walks in and starts teaching a lesson about a certain topic. And oftentimes members can sit there and be like, where did this come from? Why are we talking about this or that? and without the leader like really articulating maybe the wrestle they've been through or the struggle or what makes them lose sleep at night, right? And being like, this is just on my mind, whether it's a personal experience or something I'm, facing with my family, or this is like God is like making me wrestle with this thing. So we're going to talk about it, right? I think just articulating that journey of like, this is what I'm going through. And that's why we're talking about this. Maybe we shouldn't talk about this. I don't know. But this is where my mind is constantly pushed as the key holder, as the person that's the leader. I think that goes a long way rather than just jumping in and being like, no, this is what we're going to talk about. And this is the direction we're going. And this is the new theme or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other principle concept that you want to make sure we cover before we wrap up?
Maybe one, and that is, what does it mean to be heard? So we struggled with this as Sarah and I were working through getting the sisters to feel like they were being heard in a ward council, or that their opinion mattered. What we found out was some of them think being heard is getting our way. And it's the same for brethren as well. A member of the High Council, they didn't listen to me if we didn't come out with a decision that they went in thinking that ought to be. And so I think it's important to understand that when we're counseling together, we're not always going to get our way, and that's not what unity is going to look like. So just because it didn't come out the way you think it should doesn't mean that the leader didn't take that into consideration and didn't weigh their opinion in that matter, because not everybody agrees that's the way things ought to be.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand that getting your way, just because you didn't get your way didn't mean you weren't heard.
Yeah. And oftentimes we walk into a meeting, feeling like, no, I felt a strong spiritual nudging in this arena or with this idea. And so the council will most likely go this way. But then when it doesn't, we begin to think, wait a minute, I wasn't heard. Like, let me explain to you one more time, like why this is so necessary. But to just be at peace of the council process. Right. And, I think that's crucial. Sarah, anything else, any other principle that we missed or concept we want to make sure we cover, or do we do a pretty good job?
No, I think it's great. And I would just encourage like the sisters to speak up more. Yeah. And to speak up more. Your voice matters.
Love it. Well, President Williams, I appreciate you doing this the week of state conference as if you had nothing else to do, right? So,
well, I'll call on Sarah to speak, so I'll be all right.
Oh, well, good. Yeah. Delegation, another strong leadership principle. This is good. Well, I've got one more question for you, and Dale, you get the last word at state conference, so we're going to give Sarah the last word here. But the question I have is, as you reflect on your time as a leader, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
I think the idea of a leader is not what the leader can do, but what can help others do. And I think when you think of Christ's life, Christ didn't do much for himself. He wanted to help others, and so that's my experience as a leader has helped me come closer to Christ, because I see people differently and I want to know what I can do to help them.
Sarah, what about you?
Oh, I think that being a leader has just helped me to increase my capacity to love others the way that the Savior loves them, because when you serve them, you see them as he does. And not because when I say that, I think it's easy to love the people that think you're great and that just, pat you on the back. Thank you so much for all that you're doing. But where I really increased my capacity to love and to become more like the Savior is when I've worked to love the people that disagree with the way that I do things, and that maybe point out my weaknesses, and so that's been really stretching for me, and something that I'm really grateful for.